vehicles in the area.
Your phrase here.
Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros esta noche. Vamos a estar dando servicios de interpretación al español. Las personas que ocupen, por favor de venir a agarrar su equipo para interpretación. Gracias.
Okay, my name is Stephen Hale. I'm the Public Information Officer for the City of Perris. I will be here tonight as a staff representative. We also have with us Mr. Robert Koo. He's representing our City Attorney's Office. And then you also met our Spanish interpreter. I'm going to turn it over to this time to Mr. Ryder Smith of Trepepi. He is going to be here to give a presentation. So without further ado, you're on the spot. I'll give you that one.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. You mind if I take my mask down here while I talk this evening, ladies? I'll maintain sufficient distance from you. So thank you very much for being here. I appreciate you being here. My name is Ryder Smith. I'm with a firm called Trepepi Smith. We do marketing, communications, public affairs work. We work with about 100 cities throughout California and the West Coast and about 70 on a regular basis. So we routinely work with local government agencies, and we're really involved in, among other things right now, our redistricting work, which we can talk about in a bit. And then as noted, Stephen is here, and Robert is here, and our Spanish interpretation is here as well. So tonight we're going to have this just a quick overview of the workshop. This is very similar to a conversation that we had a couple weeks ago when we did a virtual Zoom-only version of this. But we're going to talk about the difference between at-large elections and district elections. Then we'll get into the benefits of each of those election process, because they all have pros. Then we'll go into some district formation logistics and understand how we go from A to B if there's even a decision to move to district elections. Following that, we'll talk about the timeline to go through that process, seek any feedback from the community tonight and hear from you both about what you might have to say on this process. And then last but not least, we'll talk about how to stay involved and stay connected in this process. I should note, too, that we are broadcasting this in real time, so it's going out to the rest of the world. Just FYI, you might be on camera at some point if you choose to ask a question or whatnot, so just have it noted as such. And we are recording this evening as well, just so we have a record of this to be able to use for future conversation should we need to sustain the ongoing public engagement on this issue. So fundamentally, we ask this question, why does this process matter? And I think it's important to just recognize, as I'm sure you will well recognize since you're actively involved in the community, that in America we have representative democracy. So we elect people to make decisions about where to put fire stations and where to dispatch police officers and where to build the next park. And our ability to elect people and make those decisions for us in representative democracy is dependent upon our democratic systems that we use to elect folks and seek out representation. So fundamentally, making sure we have effective election processes that ensure solid elections that people ultimately are elected to represent the broad community interests that exist is super important to having effective government, truly representative government. So as good, active, involved citizens that are here tonight, you are participating in what I would consider foundational to good government. So some brief notes here with some data to throw up. There were, in the last 2020 election, local election here in the city of Perris, there were 32,357 registered voters in the city. Of those 32,000, 22,505 actually voted in the local election. So that's how many votes were cast in the local election. Of those, there were 18,635 cast for the mayor, and I believe that was an unopposed election at the time, so running unopposed. And then there were 30,570 votes cast for council positions. But remember, there were multiple candidates, and you could cast 2 votes. So really, you'd kind of roughly take that number divided by 2 for the number of people that actually voted for council elections. This also gives you a sense of the voter participation rate, at least as a percentage of voter participations of the total registered voters of 32,000, which is, of course, shy of the total population of the city and certainly shy of the voting age population that's in the city as well. So currently, City of Perris has what are called at-large elections, meaning you can live anywhere in the city and you are elected by all members of the community. So whether you live in the north or the south, east or the west, you get to vote in every 2 years in the election for a council member, and then every 4 years you get to vote for what would also be the at-large mayor position in the city. If you look at the history of the city, it's had very diverse election results with all sorts of different folks represented on the dais representing different races, ethnicities, and genders. Certainly the case today as we talk in terms of broad representation on the city council. But also of interest is that these elections have also yielded geographic diversity, which isn't always the case in cities, but roughly speaking in the city, we have a council member who lives on the south, a council member who lives out on the east side, the west side. I believe the mayor is up north in the city, so you have kind of all areas of the town represented. And I will just say in a number of cities, there tends to be a couple neighborhoods where everybody comes from, and so you get a lot of geographic concentration, not necessarily the case here in the city of Perris. So if we went to by-district elections, it would change the current process, right? And so there's a few fundamental principles that exist in district elections. The first and foremost is the idea and principle of equal vote representation, or one person, one vote. And what that would mean is you have to have districts that you would form that would be roughly the same size to represent the total population in those districts. And so the goal is to ensure that you don't like have one district that has 40,000 people and one that has 10,000, because that would technically mean that each voter in the 10,000 district has a lot more voting power than the people that would be diluted into 40. So when you do form districts, you generally have a total that's about upwards of 10% latitude between the largest and the smallest district in terms of how sized those districts have to be. The city council would ultimately choose how many districts are created and make the final decision about that process. And that could potentially be a process where they use an independent redistricting commission and essentially hand the power over to an independent commission to make that happen, or what is done in most cities, particularly of this size, is they retain control at the city council level to adopt what would be the final maps and the configuration of whatever the election is going to be. So theoretically, for example, they'd say, we want 4 districts. The maps are drawn to meet all sorts of criteria that we'll talk about here in a minute, and then that's voted on, adopted by the council, and those become the districts that they would vote on. In that process, you would also then decide, okay, well, how are we going to decide which districts are going to come up first for election, and then the other districts will be delayed until 4 years later, when they would then theoretically have their elections as well. So you'd end up with an alternating cycle, ideally, in how you would structure that. And then that would presume, for example, that you maintain an at-large mayor elected position who would still be subject to a vote every 4 years. So, at-large elections have been the predominant form of city council elections, and that, again, is what we have here in the city of Perris. At-large elections have certain traits that are considered positive. Number one, you get to vote more often. So no matter where you live in town, every 2 years you get to vote for somebody. You get to vote for the mayor and 2 council members, or you get to vote for 2 council members. But you're always getting a chance to participate every couple of years. Number two, you end up electing public officials who have to roam the entire community looking for votes and making sure they represent the broad interests of the community. So you don't end up with somebody who's only focused on, say, the southeast, whereas somebody else might be only focused on the northeast. You tend to focus generally on what the needs are of the community at large. And as I noted, so there's also less potential voter confusion in terms of who I get to vote for at this time, because just because you live on one side of a street or another, you aren't confused saying, well, I live on this side of the street, so I'm in Council District 2 versus Council District 3 on the other side, for example. So you just always know every 2 years I get a chance to participate in democracy in the city of Perris. Now, on the flip side, by district elections, you would have a council candidate who must be from a certain district, so they have to live in that geography, and then the people in that geography vote for that person. So it would kind of, although we've organically ended up there, it would effectively require some sort of distribution across the city where people are coming from, which would be one potential benefit. A second one is that as a result of representing certain geographic areas, they become advocates for those areas specifically, and they're always looking out for those communities of interest that reside in those specific districts. So they ensure that they're perhaps more vocal or aggressive about saying, hey, this is my District 3. District 3 includes these areas. Maybe it's lacking parks, and it becomes a big important issue for them to advocate for having parks, for example. And then a third point is that district elections can help ensure that if there are underrepresented voting blocks and communities of interest who are not effectively represented on the council, that they actually get a chance to seek elected office and have a higher probability of actually getting elected to office, wrapped around the idea of there being a cohesive community of interest that dominates in a particular geographic space and contingent upon all the other rules and regulations at the federal and state level that exist around district drawing. So one kind of byproduct of that, too, is when you have a district election format, then you also, because you tend to have smaller races, the races are less expensive. You can tend to walk your district more likely. And so it can be a little more affordable to run those elections, which means some people may be able to participate in running for election who otherwise might not because the economics are too difficult or their access to raise money for fundraising and political campaigns was limited. So that could be another reason why they would, why you get better representation or improved representation by district elections. So I've used this term communities of interest a couple times, and I'd like to just pause on this slide and talk about this a bit because communities of interest are part and parcel of the redistricting process and really fundamental to district formation activity. So communities of interest could be represented around any idea that is a community of interest, meaning it could be a neighborhood, it could be an area where they have a shared community of interest in fire mitigation, a shared community interest in water quality, a shared community interest in the schools that they attend. It could be a shared community interest just by right of being next to a major road that creates lots of pollution issues, or it could be a community interest rooted in discussions about land use planning, and maybe there's too much of a certain type of construction going on in the town. There's a community interest that's formed that wants to protect that because they're proximate to that construction activity. So communities of interest could be defined. That could also include socioeconomic factors. It could include certain cultural traits and characteristics. The law is pretty careful not to get too tight into directly saying racial gerrymandering, which is why you look at all these other criteria, which may have socioeconomic correlation to some of those criteria, but fundamentally we're looking at communities of interest exclusive of particular ethnic representation specifically. So when you go through a district formation process or you are redistricting, you're always talking to your public about identifying those communities of interest. And then when you go to draw your lines, goal number one usually is to make sure that you keep that group together. So you don't want to dilute or break them up. You want to make sure that they can stay uniform together so their interests aren't diluted by splitting them across a couple districts. To be fair, that's really based upon community feedback. So we could have a meeting and hopefully we'd have 50 people in a room, and those 50 people are answering questions, and we say, tell us about your community of interest. And if somebody says, well, I'm from Lakeside, and in our community of interest, we have these 3 issues that are really important to us, but we'd like to make sure we get as much opportunity to be represented on the council. So we'd like 3 different council seats to come into our neighborhood and carve out a chunk. Somebody may express that. And because the process is community-driven, we'd be wanting to be responsive to that community feedback. Now, obviously, somebody else could disagree with them and express a different opinion, and we'd have 2 alternatives, and the demographer would have to consider that. The council would have to consider that when they go to adopt maps, for example. Usually, most communities of interest decide they want to be unified, not get divided, but that's really up to the public. That's not me judging one way or the other about what they would choose to do in those particular cases. So I want to pause for a second because I did a lot of talking very quickly there, but I want to give you guys a chance to ask me any questions since we have this very low ratio of attendees to speaker. You get a chance to talk. Hopefully I can do my best to answer your question. If I can't, I'll defer to the city attorney if it's in his bailiwick, and if not, I will take a note on it and we will come back and follow up with a question or an answer for you. But do you all have any questions at this time?
So you were saying that certain, like if there's one representative, like the different.
Oh, yeah, hang on 1 second. Let me give you a mic.
We're all live streaming, so we might have somebody that wants to hear that question. Be a good one.
I was going to repeat the question, but you're...
So the question is that if in a redistricting situation, like in my area, if my city councilman that is in my area we want to deal with, like, say, the homeless, because we have a lot of problems with the homeless, maybe not in other areas of the city, but so if the city councilman that represents our area wants more funding or wants more resources put into that area, would there be a negative as far as the other city councilmen or other people not wanting to give that city councilman any money or any funds for that particular area? Would there be differences between all of them, kind of like arguing or maybe fighting against monies that are coming into the city to be dispersed in the way they want it in their area? Would other areas be more I guess depending on the city councilman's clout, I guess, how much would that affect this type of redistricting in our communities?
Sure, that's a great question. So, and I think it looks like we have a professional mic handler over here who's going to sanitize that bad boy for us, so we'll make sure we keep it clean. Thank you. Excellent question and excellent observation. So this has a lot to do with political theory, and every council is going to be a special, unique circumstance in terms of how they approach the realities of having, say, a divided community with district elections. In some areas, you see, much like, say, in Congress, right, at the federal level, people advocate for their district specifically, and they only particularly care about the interests of their district, and as long as they're getting Project X back to their community, then they're achieving their success, right? And that usually means political jockeying and other activities that raise complexity at City Hall, is I think the appropriate way to put that. On the other hand, there is at least one person who is consistently from the dais and other platforms raising an issue and trying to explain why this is in the broader interests of the community, and therefore we should all be seeking to fund Program X because it's a broad community benefit that needs to be addressed. So you get both the benefit of having somebody who's super focused on the issue and the potential that they are isolated in their focus because they're the only one of, say, 4 council members that is particularly affected by this challenge because it's isolated to one area of the town. Now, you'd want to believe, and obviously I think there are plenty of council members that prove that just because they're from District X, they recognize that it affects quality of life across the city, and that one problem that happens in one district can metastasize and go to other parts of the city, and therefore you want to kind of take it on, right? And I think that becomes partly politics and partly a philosophical response about how that gets done. So it's hard for me to impose what an assumption would be. I would just say you do see in some jurisdictions that fighting for your district does become a challenge in that environment. Flip side is it gives an opportunity for that particular challenge to be elevated by a particular council member who's deeply passionate about the issue because it's right in their district, right? It could be in their neighborhood because they're from that area, so to speak. Good question. I tried to show both sides of that. Do you have another extra? We'll go back here.
Hello there. I'm not too sure how much I missed. I did get here late, but I was just curious on how the districts are going to be created. Is it by population, geographic location? And if it's by location, is it going to be redistributed, like redistricted every 10 years with the census? Because, you know, as population grows, each area becomes bigger and bigger, and each one needs more representation.
Sure. That's a great question. That's a great question. So first, I'll answer by saying tonight's conversation and the one we had before are all exploratory, right? So this is really just about trying to have a conversation with the public to see what people even think about this and give them a chance to explain the issue. I often think there's really no point in having a conversation with the public about an issue until we at least take 20 minutes to explain the complexities of it to then actually engage in a great dialogue back and forth, right? So these are really about an opportunity to talk with you all and then having listened to me drone on for a bit to get some excellent questions back like we got, like yours and yours, to talk about some of these things. So that said, this is an exploration, which means I can't presuppose we are going to districts. If we were going to districts, and I didn't actually quite get to that timeline yet, but you are correct. The census triggers redistricting. So we aren't in districts now, but we would use data from the 2020 census to form districts. And districts are formed using total population, and it has to be population balanced within about within 10% of the maximum and the minimum, right? So if you had 100,000, say you had I got to do my math here, right? So if you had a 100,000 person population, then and you had 5 districts, each district would be ideally at 20,000 people, right? 1/5 with 5 districts. Or if we had 100,000 with 4 districts, each one would be 25,000 people in that. Now you could go up and down a little bit, 23,000, 27,000 thereabouts, and you'd still be within the limits or close to it. I'm not quite doing the math quickly in my head, but I think you get the point. You don't have to be perfect. And then every 10 years, you do go through redistricting. So you have to do population readjustments, and you usually move the district lines and shift them to accommodate for new development and new growth and things like that have come along that have affected the population balance. And the reason you do that every 10 years is to ensure kind of one person, one vote, where you have roughly the same political power spread within the populations within that 10% kind of threshold to make sure you kind of have equitable elections between the districts. So that's usually how that works. So just a comment on that to provide more context. State of California had implemented a law that effectively was encouraging cities to form districted or by-district elections if certain criteria were being struck upon. And one of the consequences of this law, which is California Voting Rights Act, is that we've definitely seen districts form more often. So there were about 25 cities that had by-district elections in 2010 when the last census took place. And we're now up to about 170 cities that now have by-district elections. And for context, there's 482 cities in California. So still by far and away, not the majority of cities have do not have district elections, but there's clearly a trend. And now with the 2020 census, the amount of work to go through all those cities and redistrict the 170 plus it's a ton of work. It's a mad scramble. And right now, as we talk tonight, the state of California is redistricting. Riverside County is redistricting, and then various cities like City of Riverside are redistricting as well. So you'll have like multiple layers of and water districts could be redistricting. So you could have multiple and school districts could also, if they're districted, they could be redistricting simultaneously. Lots of redistricting. It's a great time to be in the redistricting business. Did that answer your question sufficiently? Excellent. All right. Any other great questions? Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned gerrymandering. What does that mean?
So that is essentially when you try to draw the lines to manipulate the outcome of voting power. So one way, say you have a voting block that always votes a certain way, and there are enough of them to form a successful outcome for a particular election, say a political party, right? Political party P. And so if there's enough of those voters together to actually control one of the districts and elect a representative of party P to be their elected leader, you could gerrymander the district where you carve out just enough of those and isolate them in a different district where you divide their power, and then they can't get any one person, any member representing party P to actually make it onto the elected board. So that would be that's called cracking. And then there's another idea which is called packing, which means you actually try to put all the party P people in one district and you cram them all in there so that they essentially could have like an 80 or 90% domination, for example, in that district, but then there's no other party P people left in the community to vote any of the other districts. So then the party L people are able to get all their people elected on the other 4 districts, for example. Does that make sense what I'm describing? Mm-hmm. So it's a way of trying to, and then there's other kind of signs of gerrymandering. If you look at how districts are drawn, where there'll be big arms that are kind of funny shaped, and they go in, they try to grab other communities, and they got these weird shapes. Those are kind of telltale signs that there's some awkwardness and intent behind what was done to try to grab certain communities and pull them together to achieve certain outcomes. So those could be other telltale signs of trying to use how you draw the lines to create or favor one particular party or interest over another. And that's fundamentally what that is.
So does that happen?
So it certainly happens. Yes, there's a history of it happening. Does it continue to happen to this day? Probably. Does it happen in California? I can't speak to that specifically or provide a specific example. What I would say is, particularly with the Fair Maps Act that was adopted and went into effect in January of 2020, which dictates the district drawing process and the redistricting process and the amount of outreach we have to do and a bunch of other factors, it also defined a whole series of criteria for what you have to adhere to when you're drawing districts. So, and it actually rank orders what those priorities are in the process. And because there's been a lot of specifications around that, it's really makes some of the shenanigans much less available, so to speak. Like you just kind of, you follow the priorities, you stick with the rules, and a lot of it comes down to math combined with the art of understanding communities of interest and having effective community engagement. And if you stick to those criteria, it doesn't leave a lot of room. And by way of example, one of the top criteria is the idea of compactness. Districts have to be compact. Well, it's very hard to draw a district that goes out and has these funny arms to grab communities to create your super special district, because by nature that's not compact if you're bypassing one community to get to another. So just that one criteria alone really tamps down the amount of gerrymandering, so to speak, that would be present in a process. Yeah. Thanks for being my microphone person tonight.
Do you happen to know any other cities in the area that go by district elections?
That is a great question. So, quick answer is no, I don't know that off the top of my head. As I said, there's about 170 cities in all of California that do this, right? And you typically have seen it in some of the bigger cities where it tends to start out. So, like Santa Ana has been having it for a while now. Yes, Riverside. I did mention briefly, Riverside actually is redistricting. So that's another big city that has by-district elections at this time. Actually, I think Murrieta has by-district elections as well, because they're going through the redistricting process right now. So, and I think also Temecula has by-district elections, if I recall correctly. So there are a number of jurisdictions in Riverside County alone. We worked on the Palm Desert. They went to by-district elections recently. They did a very unique solution where they had a downtown representation district with a single council member, and then they had an at-large 4 other council members that wrapped around downtown like a donut almost. And so they had this, they maintain an at-large feel for kind of the shared community of interest of all these parts, and then they wanted to have a specific community of interest represented with their downtown core, and that was what we heard from the public when they drew that up. And so that was the ultimate solution that they implemented there, which was a pretty unique solution. So you're certainly seeing more and more cities end up on this pathway or one way or the other. And there's any number of factors that are kind of driving that at this point in time. Was there any other city I missed that's district from? Yeah, I think that's a pretty decent list of Riverside County districts. These are awesome questions, guys. Thank you. You're making my job a lot easier tonight. Okay, I'm going to keep talking through here. So let's imagine a world where if theoretically there was a desire to move forward on forming and having district by district elections in city of Perris, what would that actually look like? So first of all, there'd be a discussion about how many districts are necessary to have in the city. Should we have 4 plus an at-large mayor? Would you have 5 by district elections and just 5 council members? Would you have 7 council members, right? So, or 6 plus an at-large mayor, for example. So there's, all those options theoretically are thrown on the table as possibilities, but the default would probably be to take where your existing formation is right now with an at-large mayor and 4 council members and create 4 districts for your council elections and maintain an at-large mayor would kind of be a default, but that's not me dictating, it's just an observation. Then you'd have a discussion about an election cycle and which seats are going to be able to win for what the priorities would be in terms of who's going to be up for re-election at what year and how that cycle is going to alternate every 2 years, 2 different district seats will be up, and then obviously the mayor will be on a different cycle. And then ultimately, if the effort is desired to go to district elections, there's several routes that can be pursued. The one that's most common is that the city council kicks off a process. It's very well defined where there are 4 public hearings that take place, one of which has to be either after 6 o'clock at night and or on the weekends. You invite all the public to come in and comment on their ideas about communities of interest and the maps that are drawn. There's a period of time when the data must first be made available to the public for the public to draw maps, and then the city can also start participating in that process and drawing maps. And then ultimately the city council votes by ordinance typically and declares these are the maps we're going to adopt and these will be going to effect at election X, and you're off to the races with your maps. Sometimes those processes would involve community workshops, so doing something like this, hopefully with a lot of people in the room and a big robust conversation to really talk about those communities of interest and explain the process in great detail. Oftentimes there are mapping software tools that are made available to the public to be able to actually get in and draw maps. Sometimes they're paper-based, oftentimes they're computer-based. And that's one of the more rewarding aspects of working in the redistricting world is, unlike a lot of big public policy challenges, you actually really empower the public to be able to draw maps and participate in the process. And oftentimes it's a citizen-drawn map that maybe gets tweaked to adjust for legal issues, but is ultimately adopted as the map. That's kind of considered a very successful process when it's a member of the public who's participating in that, and it's not just a map that's been adopted by the city council, just written by the county's consultant or the city's consultant. One other thing I'll just note, generally when you form districts, you're going to engage a professional demographer, right? This is somebody who has expertise in the law and expertise in the the software tools that are necessary to create legally compliant districts. And then they take that knowledge we gain of hearing from the public about communities of interest and the work that we often do on outreach and redistricting and combine that all to create maps and create options or work with the public on maps that maybe you draw. And then we take that map in and the demographer will check it for legal validity and then work with you to fix some things to make sure it's legally compliant. And then that becomes a map and it becomes numbered. And it goes into the options that are available to the elected body to make a decision about what kind of districts to form. So that whole process can take usually no faster than 90 days, probably more like 180 days typically, is how that would normally go in a normal cycle. And I think I have, so I'll talk a little bit about that timeline here too. So in a typical, right now, we're doing a bunch of redistricting work. And there are a few agencies that are using the new census data. They deferred on forming districts until the census data was out, and then they wanted to use the new 2020 census data. This year, it's a particularly complex period of time because normally the census comes out in April, and you have all of April through usually until April of 2022, if your elections are in November of 2022, to adopt your maps and move forward. And that's really driven in part by the registrar of voters and for the county of Riverside and them needing time to get these new districts put together and do all the necessary elements to actually having successful elections by districts. So what's happened this year is the census data, because of COVID, was delayed. So we didn't actually get the data from the federal government until a couple weeks ago. I think August 12th is when the data became available. And the state of California has to take that data and they have to take state prison population numbers and reallocate them back into their last known addresses of the prison population for the state prisoners, not the federal. And then those numbers become the official numbers to use. So that's a lot of complex way of saying we are only going to get that data here maybe on the late September, and then we're going to have only from end of September until April to actually review that data, use that data, and draw maps for agencies that are seeking to draw maps. So that's kind of this November 2022 election bullet point here. If, since the city is kind of exploring this issue right now, and given all the mayhem going on with district formation and redistricting right now, and frankly, redistricting fatigue that exists out there a little bit, the other possibility is to defer on the process. And if you were going to move, even, first of all, you have to make a decision about forming districts. And if you said, yeah, we'd like to go form some districts, start that process off where you try to get through the mapping process in end of 2022-23, with the idea being that you would actually have the districts in place for the 2024 election, and then it would be 2024, 2026, and go on from there. And that would allow sufficient time for lots of planning. All the redistricting resources that are super doing redistricting right now would be available for a district formation process. And I mean, if anything, the city would even end up probably with better pricing in that situation just because there'd be more consultants available. It's not this peak demand that's going on right now for help. So that would be the typical timeline on something like that moving forward. So this is a map. It's probably a little hard to see, so my apologies, but team did a good job of pulling together a map. And what you're looking at here are an overlay of census tracts combined with the specific outline in pink. Everything in the pink area is the city of Perris. So essentially what that's showing you, and the numbers are very small to read, I apologize, but it's essentially giving you population counts in, well, those are census tract numbers that are on the on each of the pink spots, and then on the top right corner, again, very hard to see. My eyes are horrible, but those are population counts that are in each of those census tracts. Some of those numbers actually do overstate population a bit because census tracts are bigger than census blocks, and some of these census tracts go far beyond the edge of the city. So they're including population right now with these numbers that are actually. Oh yeah, there's another TV there that might be easier to see if you want to take a look at that. But essentially, the population numbers that are there are inclusive of some of the unincorporated parts of the county that are Perris adjacent, so to speak, and so they're getting included with some of the census tract data that's present. Did I accurately reflect that statement? I think so. Okay. And I'll pause for a minute and let you just kind of chew on that. And I think we'll make this PowerPoint deck available for download on the website. Absolutely. So you'll have access to be able to get to more information on this if you so desire.
There are sections of this that touch the Perris unincorporated that we don't see out of that. And that's where some of the numbers might not fully reflect the data population because those are parts of the unincorporated part of Perris versus the actual city limit of Perris. Correct.
They don't vote in your Perris elections, your city of Perris elections, correct. So they shouldn't be counted as part of the districting process, obviously. Well, they should not be part of the districting process because they don't have voting rights and they're not voters in the city. So. And like I said, we'll have this PowerPoint deck on, the city has a whole web page dedicated to a bunch of information on this matter. So we'll have a page up with this PowerPoint deck in there so you'll be able to drill into this. And I think we'll try to get a PDF of this file too so you can zoom in on it a bit more as well. So I think that actually, I guess I'll pause here for real quick. Are there any questions, comments, or thoughts? Yeah, sure. Hang on one second. Let's get the microphone to you.
So when we vote for the city elections, now we're talking about unincorporated areas. A lot of those people feel very left out when it comes to an election in Perris, and I'm sure any other places. Because I have friends and other people that say, well, how come I can't vote in that? And I said, well, because you're not in the actual city of Perris. But I live in that area, and so I need why can't I vote? So a lot of the people feel left out when it comes to them living in those areas because they have to either call the county or they've got to, and they're like, we don't get any help from the county. Why can't we get help from the city? So there's a lot of, back and forth with people that feel they're left out in the participation with the city, even though a lot of times they're close to this city and they participate in a lot of the things in the city,
Right.
but they cannot participate in the vote.
Yeah, so it's so there's this couple of observations. No doubt they're in the sphere of influence for the city, so they have an interest in the services, right, and other features that are great, and it's a good sign that people want to be in the city of Perris, right, and wish they were a part of the city. Second thing is fundamentally that is less of a voting rights issue and much more of kind of just an annexation representation issue, and to be a part of the city, they'd actually have to get annexed into the city and add that into the footprint for the city of Perris, which is an entirely different process. I will also observe that technically anybody can draw maps. So even if they don't live in the city, they can certainly draw maps and submit map ideas and have influence on the district formation process or redistricting process. This came up in another county where we were working, and we pointed out that people outside the county can be, you could be sitting in Australia submitting maps for the city of Perris if there was a process going on. So there's no requirement that the maps that are submitted by the public actually be residents in the city, which is kind of funny, but it is what it is. So, other questions or comments? What do you guys think about this entire process or the exploration of it? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? All right, lay it on me.
Man, as someone who lives on like the little corner, I don't know if I can see the map. I see the map right there. I live in the smallest little square, the last one, the one with the population with 8,000. That's where I live. And just a block away is still in the community, but they're no longer city of Perris. So I think it's really funny, but I'm not too sure if you're familiar with how to annex, like how to incorporate them into their city, because I'm pretty sure like a huge chunk of Mid-Valley, Gavilan Hills, Good Hope, they would love to become city of Perris, but I'm not too sure how familiar you are with that process. I know it's not part of the districting process, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, that is not an area I could speak on. I suspect if you, as a reward for being a good active citizen tonight and showing up, if you want to pull the city attorney aside after this, I'll volunteer him as tribute, and you can ask him a question like that when we're done with the conversation tonight. That's a good one. Anybody else have thoughts on districts, not districts, what that means to you, why you should care? Yeah, no, please. You earn the right. You're here. You showed up. You get a voice.
Thank you. Well, I've traveled a lot. I've traveled and I've lived everywhere here in Southern California. I lived a while in Temecula, Murrieta, and Riverside, Perris all my life, in LA. I've noticed that Perris is the most diverse area, even within the specific special interest communities, because there's a big difference between like little tiny blocks. Little blocks of like downtown is very different to west side is very different to the north side, and really, really want to be involved in with how the communities are, the districts are made, because like even within representation with the city planning commissioners, all of them are like on one side of the city. The council members they're kind of spread out, but they're still only representing. They only live around that area, so they only know that area. So districting would be a good idea, because each block gets their own representation. But I would like to see the planning commissioners go districting first, then the council members. That would be a better idea, just to see how the feel of it is first. But
So there's not, to the best of my knowledge, there's not a process that would have planning commissioners necessarily be from certain districts. That could happen organically, just with the council trying to find people from certain areas, and potentially that's a legally permissible selection criteria for where you pick your planning commissioners from. But I would defer to the city attorney on that specific answer. He's probably shaking his head in the back of behind me right now going, what? Wait, hang on a second, we'll get you a mic.
Just to clarify, the planning commission is appointed by the city council, as you said. So by nature, the council could be choosing people from their own communities, or, if they're already in their districts, let's just say they might be choosing people from their districts. But generally speaking, it's an appointed body, so there's really no electing. They're not elected officials, basically. So,
And one other comment, just to your point, and it's not to argue with the point you raised, but just it was a comment I made before you made it in here, which is looking at generally the map right now. And as you kind of noted, there's a city council member from every part of the city. There's somebody down south, somebody all the way up north, somebody on the east side, somebody on the west side. So there is some, unlike a lot of other cities, there's actually some pretty decent geographic diversity right now in the city, which doesn't say the point wouldn't be made to kind of enshrine that with districts. But for organically, you've achieved some of that at this point in time. What do you think about districts? Do you have any thoughts you want to share? You want to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down on that? Thumbs up on district formation? Do you feel like people aren't effectively represented today with the council in terms of the diversity of their opinions and perspectives, or is somebody kind of sidelined? And I'll have you take a microphone if you don't mind me putting you on the spot. Okay. You're resisting my entreaties.
What was the question?
So the
again?
question is, do you feel, if you just look at the way things are today, do you have any concerns that there are folks who aren't able to get to council, or who don't have their viewpoints represented, or that there's some community of interest out there that isn't effectively being represented on the city council?
I think the city is represented, with the diversity of the city council that we have, it's diverse. I think that a lot of the people that live in the city, and I've lived in the city for a very, very long time, so I've kind of grown up here. Sometimes I think when the city council members get on board, I think sometimes maybe we feel that they forget us. And so there's certain areas that are more taken care of than others.
Okay.
So where I live, which is in Indian Hills and what part of Enchanted Heights, we feel like we're like the stepchild.
Okay.
We're forgotten up there versus, say the north side with all the brand new homes and the fancy places and, So I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think a lot of the people that live in that area feel the same way.
Right.
Now, we are getting a new park out there, but it took a long time to do that. And so, but a lot of the people in that neighborhood, and I know probably the majority of them, because I've worked in the city, and it wasn't in the city, I was a letter carrier, so I knew a lot of people in the city.
You delivered postal mail?
Yes.
All right, you got your steps in.
Postal checks and, the whole thing. But so that's what I would hear from people, and they feel very neglected in that area versus other areas that are very well maintained and very well upkept, the new side. So that's kind of the thing that a lot of the people feel. So the representation, diversity-wise, is good. I think it's just that they forget that we're there. And maybe it's because a lot of people don't participate. Obviously, as you can see, there's 30,000 people in the city, and there's only 3 of us here. And it comes the same way when, say, the sheriff's department has an event or something, there's very few people. When it comes to, say, the community or
Right.
the police department wanting to get some kind of,
Yep.
So that's,
You said something really important, and you provided a great example for the public. Yeah, good job. So, and I just want to point it out and highlight it, right? So you effectively just described a communities of interest, right? You said it's Indian Hills? Yes. And Enchanted Heights. So you just described 1 or 2 different communities of interest that exist in the community. And if we were drawing districts, there would be a question that would be posed. Do those represent communities of interest? Should they be divided, or should they remain whole? And how should they be, if they are going to be kept together, kind of what holds them together? How would you define those areas? And what's the geography that brings them together, right? Is it well known as a street or something like that? So go ahead, comment on that.
yeah. So when you say that these 2 communities of interest, one of the things about that community of interest is that Indian Hills is a little separate, and then we've got Enchanted Heights. Also, Enchanted Heights is divided by 2 streets or 3 streets are unincorporated,
Okay.
and they are part of also the city. So when the city was doing a water project out there where they were bringing in a sewer project, there was an issue because it was only going to be the city, and then the unincorporated said, wait, what about us? So obviously, there was the work between the city council, the water department, and, the water resources development people. I don't remember what they were called, but
Sure.
they all worked together to bring that sewer system into the entire community, including the unincorporated area.
Okay.
So, when we have that issue with redistricting, we're going to still have an issue with those 3 streets that are part of the city and feel like they're a part of the city, but won't be able to vote.
Right.
So there's that
So
issue.
that's
So we
a-
have a huge, another issue with that area as well.
Yep. That's very helpful feedback and a great example. So that is the kind of stuff we want to hear, right? Like this, what you just described is exactly why we're doing these community forums. So good job. Gold star for you. I'd give it to you, except I don't want to give you COVID on the star. So you're also heading towards a gold star too. So lay it on. What do you got?
I knew she looked familiar. I knew it. I live on Altura. I don't know if you know where. I live on Altura.
So did you used to deliver his mail?
Yeah, all the time. But yeah, so one of the things that brings us all together is that we are a commuter community.
Mm-hmm.
Majority of us don't work within the city of Perris.
Yep.
Another sad fact, because I've traveled so much, I get a lot of connections with professors. I have a mutual Twitter following with this professor from the University of Texas in Austin. He does statistics throughout the country, and we found out that 20% of the population of Perris leaves their house from 12 a.m. and 5 a.m. So that's, I don't know how much the population, but 20%.
So from midnight to 5 a.m. in the morning, 20% of the population leaves the city?
To get to work.
20%?
Yeah.
20% of the worker population or 20% of the whole population?
20% of the working population.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Wow.
that's a lot. And we're the number 1 in the entire nation. Number 2 is Lake Elsinore. Number 3 is some city in Utah. And number 4 is Menifee. And this is all just the commuter area.
And I assume that's people trying to commute to L.A.?
LA and Irvine, Orange County area.
Okay.
I was 19, waking up at 3 a.m. to get to Santa Ana by 7 a.m. The 91 is just crazy. But that's one of the reasons why we're all like really tight. Everyone is awake at 4 a.m. We kind of like, we're a really tight community. We don't need a community, what's a community watch? We don't need it. We just have
Neighborhood
everyone's
watch
phone
program?
numbers. We have, neighborhood watch. We don't need that. We're all up. We're all commuting.
Seemingly.
But yeah, at the same time, we like to walk around. It's a walking neighborhood. And one of the things I'm really not angry with, but just mad with the council members, is that they're building this new park with 50 parking spaces. We don't need 50 parking spaces. And if anybody who does want to come to this park, who doesn't live within the community, there's a bus route that can take them there. There are other alternatives to get in there. But 50 parking spaces, that means 50 cars have to come into the community. And it's just a lot more traffic than what we can already hold. People have 6 cars, 3 are parked inside, 3 are parked on the street. When more people are coming to the park, they're gonna have to not park in the parking lot. They're gonna have to park in front of our homes. They're gonna have to park in front of our homes. So they didn't listen to us when we told them, hey, relax with the parking spots. But like, nah, let's put more parking spaces. You know, that's America right there. They love parking spots. They love parking spaces. But
So I'll make a point. You also identified a community of interest, which is early risers, and people have to commute out of town, right? So they have their own distinct interests as a community. Now that may be across the entire city, not isolated to one. So you're kind of back to, we just need one giant district for the whole city, which is at-large elections, because there's that shared interest. The reality is, you could still, if that's a universal truth across Perris, that could be represented in at-large or by district elections, and theoretically that is represented in a unified front on lobbying for transportation improvements and improvements to the 91 and train access and other things like that that are more regional transportation issues that would try to mitigate that, or which I'm sure the city is working on, like economic development efforts to try to bring those jobs here so that people don't have to drive all the way. I'm sure that actually in some ways COVID was very helpful for some of those folks who had to used to drive into Orange County and LA, and they were able to work more from home. So very interesting. That's great feedback. And I'd love to know how the professor grabbed that stat. I'll have to check that out.
I'd like to just offer a little clarity on our numbers. We're going to get our census numbers in later on this month, but we're probably somewhere in the 75,000 range as a city, and that does not count unincorporated parts of Perris. That's Perris proper in that sense. But we'll have a more definitive statement on that later on this month, hopefully.
And so when you saw earlier, you saw these numbers that we had. Yeah. So that's registered voters, right? So roughly what that's now, of course, within that 75,000 number, right? Like some of those folks are not 18. So
and that's
they
approximate. Please
right.
don't quote me on that.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I mean, we got some rough numbers that came out from the census. So the present population number isn't going to change that much. If you're at 75,000 roughly for your population, and this was a year ago when you had your registered voters at 32, you're roughly looking at half your population is actually registered to vote. Now, and another quarter of your population could be under the age of 18. So really, you only have like 25% of your population who's not registered to vote, but is able to vote. They just haven't. So that'll give you more of some context. And those numbers are not like abysmal, certainly by any stretch of imagination. That's relatively consistent with California general voting patterns. So, thank you for clarifying the total population count. Any other, did you get any brilliant ideas on communities of interest inspired by your co-conspirators here in the audience? Anything you want to share? No? All right. I'm sorry to keep putting you on the spot. I'm just so excited to have 3 people here. I just want to put you guys through the ringer. Okay, so this is really our final slide and point of conversation tonight, which is what's next. So we are theoretically scheduled to go to the City Council on September 28th and provide some feedback to the City Council. Our first forum that we had pretty limited participation and not a ton of questions, so we weren't sure what to expect tonight. We did a lot of heavy advertising and had free food this evening to try to get people to come on down and have a conversation with us. And so I'm a little bit emotionally wrought over the fact that I could only muster 3 friends tonight, but I'll survive. My ego is going to be intact. So our feedback, you guys have represented the great feedback we've gotten so far. We've done a couple social media polls and things like that too. Bottom line, we'll be having a conversation with staff about how to advance this discussion. Like I said, we are on track right now to go towards a city council meeting on the 28th and kind of report back what happened when we tried to talk to the community about these issues. And that'll happen right in this very room on the 28th. And certainly what I would love is when you leave here tonight to talk to some of your neighbors about this issue. Send emails to the districtelections@cityofparis.org email address that's here, and offer more thoughts or insights, or talk about communities of interest, or talk about your thoughts about at-large versus district elections and the pros and cons, because I tried to very evenly balance out the pros and cons of either one of those options, because there's trade-offs in everything. That is the story of life. Any mature adult recognizes that. But that's the plan. And so we'd love to hear feedback from you, and that'll be it for what's next. And that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any other questions you guys may have about this process. Otherwise, we can wrap it up. Okay, we'll take one more question in the back here.
Just a hypothetical. So, there's a new community being planned, right? And you can buy the parcel of land. The homes isn't built yet, but you bought the parcel of land. Can those people vote saying they'll be living in the future? Like, oh, I'll live there in 2 months. The election's in a month. Can I vote, within that? And because, you want your representation. You're going to be there for 20 years. You got a 20-year mortgage,
Sure.
right?
I'll let the city attorney answer that question first.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Is it,
So the question is, if you don't yet live in the town, but you're buying into a housing development where you will own property in town, if you don't live in town, can you still register to vote here, or do you have to register where you actually reside?
that's a complicated question, but generally speaking, you'd have to be a registered voter of the city before you can vote in any city election. So you just have to fill out with the county, their paperwork, and you fill that out. Presumably that's true, right? All that information is true, but it's a fairly complicated question, but yeah.
So there would be a question about whether you meet the residency requirement to claim that you live at that particular address. And of course, you can't be dual registered somewhere else. That would be a violation of the law. You're only supposed to get one ballot. So I will say there's a related point to that, which is regardless of, first of all, there are provisional ballots. So even if you can register to vote on the day of an election and cast a provisional ballot. At least that's my understanding of how it works these days. And they hold it aside until they can validate it, and then they'll include it in the count. When you draw district lines, because of that variability you're allowed, right, that 10% variance, you do have an ability to kind of undercount an area, knowing that there's housing development going in there, so that over the course of the next 10 years, as more housing units go in, it'll add population to that particular district, right? So you could theoretically, underpopulated district, say we're roughly doing 20,000 per, you could underpopulate it by 2,000 or 3,000, thinking, okay, there's a housing development going in with like 400 households, that's gonna add, 1,600 people to the population on that area, and it's gonna raise up the population in that particular district. You're allowed a little bit of wiggle room to try to anticipate some of those things. And then, of course, by the time the census rolls around, there may be even more people there, and you'll repopulation balance at that point. So it kind of accommodates for some of what you're describing. All right? Any other hypotheticals you want to throw at us? Any free legal advice you want to get from the city attorney tonight? I'm just kidding. That was a joke. Yeah. Okay.
So within the community, majority of them are renters. So because of renting and how things are going, they might be moving. As the population moves and spreads around a lot, moves around a lot. Would they? I'm not too sure what how voting rights work and voting laws work. Like, would you have to, once you move, you'd have to re-register again? Would you also be able to, live somewhere else but still be registered there because if you move that fast, or I don't know how that works.
So I think some of these are well outside my purview of election law expertise, and I'd have to defer to an election law expert. I suspect our attorney would also prefer to defer to an election law expert. I will say that when it comes to district formation, it doesn't really matter, in that when the data that we're using to draw districts is driven entirely by census data. Even if you think the census data undercounted populations or had flaws, the law says you use the census data. That's our only fact that we can go with. So when the census was executed, we counted populations that were here. We're using those populations to create consistently equally numbered districts based on population to ensure equitable voting rights in each district if that district is actually formed. So in that regard, from a district formation perspective, we address the question of kind of what would generally be described as a more fluid population or transient population as they move in and out of rental units versus generally single-family residential ownership populations tend to stay put longer than renters, just by nature of the ownership equation. So in that situation, your census data is kind of covered for that and made sure that you at least have district formation that is done on an equitable basis.
I would add that for questions about voter registration, you can go to the county registrar of voters, and they can help you with those questions.
They love voting questions there. They live for that kind of stuff. So light them up. Absolutely. Hang on one second. Let's get a mic. Let's get a mic for you. Well, if it doesn't make sense, then my answer will match that.
Okay, so with the redistricting, the city of Perris, the little local area of Perris is very small. There's not a lot of growth. But going on the outside, towards the north side and even towards the, south side or something where Ethanac is and all that. So there's a huge amount of growth over there. There's a lot of growth over on the north side as well. But this little area is pretty much stagnant. There's not much growth. So how would be the difference between, like, these places are growing and growing, redistricting, this kind of stays the same, so it doesn't really add a lot more. Would there be a difference, or would those districts eventually be like cut off, or redistricted over, so that it wouldn't be like there's a huge amount in there and then we're still kind of stagnant. There's no growth here.
So you are you're defining data as your census population data. So we would draw the districts within that 10% variance. If we were going to districts, we would draw within the 10% variance of the data that we have at this time. And that data goes down to what's called the census block level, which generally actually means literally a block of a city. So it's a very small number. And so there are hundreds of census blocks that are all over the city. And you build those blocks together to create census tracts and to create bigger chunks, and then that's ultimately how you form districts. So you have very minute or very finite data or well-defined small chunks of data that build out those districts. So you'd build districts out of what's in downtown, and sometimes districts get built where you take chunks of downtown and they go to all, say, 4 districts that might be formed. Everybody gets an interest in downtown. Or if downtown is identified and comes out and speaks as a voice and says, hey, we're downtown, we want to be a district, then maybe that's what happens. You end up with one district that kind of takes up all of downtown, and then you end up with the kind of like suburbs on each side of town spread out. So there's any number of ways that could get sliced and diced. What would happen, though, is if over the course of 10 years you continue to see housing developments on the outskirts of town, but still within city limits, just to be clear. So in city limits, but on the outskirts of the city limits, and nothing is happening in downtown, like there's not high-density apartment developments going in and things like that, so the population is kind of getting pushed outward, then when the census comes in 2030, we would redistrict at that time, and we would make major adjustments to the lines to accommodate that growth by moving the lines around to adjust for that reality.
So would the center part of Perris be split up between, say, maybe the 4 or 5 districts involved, or would it just stay the same and be added to one of the other ones that are closer?
It depends. So technically, every time you go to redistrict, everything's on the table. You could totally scramble the lines if you want, right? Do something totally different. Maybe there's a whole new shift in population communities of interest, so it just makes more sense to do X. Maybe there's been a change in the law of what's an allowable district formation, and so that's changing up your options or your issues, right? So there could be any number of factors. It's very hard for me to kind of have conjecture on that. If you assumed, and this is all the part of your assumption, right? The hypotheticals for tonight. So if you had say one downtown district and there wasn't any growth in that district and all the other exterior areas grew, in order to have population, you just simply expand the central district of town to add more population to it to equate out to the population of what's grown around the outskirts. So that would be how you would typically try to maintain in a pure hypothetical, right? But that would be one methodology for maintaining it. And the math would dictate it because you would have to maintain equal-sized populations. All right, absolutely, great scenario. I want to thank the 3 of you for coming out tonight and asking excellent questions and participating in this process. And this is super esoteric stuff, and so it can be difficult to get your hands wrapped around, which is why you ask excellent questions. But I hope you understand how foundational it is to good representative government and democracy. So I appreciate you taking the time. Please tell your friends about it. Stay in contact with us on email, and thanks for coming out tonight. I appreciate it. All right, good night.
Just in closing, for anybody who might be watching at home, don't forget to check us out at cityofparis.org/district elections. That is our webpage for this. You'll be able to watch the playback of both of these videos and email thoughts, questions, and feedback to districtelections@cityofparis.org. Thank you for your time and have a good evening.
Thank you.